Good evening. Today we welcome you to the 2013 Joint T.C. Wallen and Nobel Peace Prize lectures. These events are sponsored by the T.C. Wallen Memorial Distinguished Lectureship in Mathematics, named to honor the memory of Thomas Carl Wallen, one of the founders of the mathematics program at Concordia. The lectures are also supported by the departments of Physics, Political Science, Religion and Sociology, as well as the Global Studies program, Divisions of Sciences and Mathematics, Academic Affairs, President's Office, and Concordia's alumnus, Brent Colby, who made a donation in Carl Bailey's name. As you can hear, this event is an effort from many departments and offices of Concordia College. Our speaker is Francesco Calogero, an Italian physicist. He graduated laurea in Fisica, which means cum laude, from the La Sapienza University of Rome in 1958, and since then has been associated with the university. He became a professor of theoretical physics in 1976. Francesco Calogero has contributed to multiple fields of mathematics and physics, including quantum field theory, scattering theory, nuclear many-body problem, solvable dynamical systems, isochronous systems, and other. His scientific publications include over 380 papers and 4 books. Francesco Calogero is active in the community of scientists concerned with nuclear disarmament. He has been one of the initiators and continues to be one of the organizers of the International School on Disarmament and Research on Conflicts and of the Italian Union of Scientists for Disarmament. His exploration of science and society issues related to arms control and disarmament has led to over 440 papers and 2 books. From 1982 to 1992, Francesco Calogero was a member of the governing board of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. From 1989 to 1997, he served as the Secretary General of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, and in that capacity he accepted on behalf of Pugwash the 1995 Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Joseph Rotblat and to Pugwash for their efforts to diminish the part played by nuclear arms in international politics and, in the longer run, to eliminate such arms. From 1997 to 2002, he served as chairman of the Pugwash Council, of which he is now an ex officio member. Just wanted to announce that tomorrow he will speak on social responsibility of scientists. On Friday, there will be a panel of students who will debate about nuclear weapon-free world. More detailed schedule of these events is on the flyers that are being distributed today. And today, Professor Calogero will speak about nuclear weapon-free world. Is it desirable? Is it feasible? We will have a chance to contemplate on these questions. After his talk, we will have a chance to ask questions and to have a short discussion, so please hang on to your questions as you listen to the talk. And after the question and answer session, we are all invited to a reception outside of this auditorium. Francesco, do you have your microphone on?
Yes, this time yes.
Let us welcome our speaker.
So thank you, Oksana, and thank you everybody for being here. And I must say that I'm very pleased to be able to say that what Professor Bailey said 27 years ago has come to pass. There has been a president of the United States who has expressed a very firm commitment to the elimination of nuclear weapons. It's not yet done, but that commitment that he was advocating has now happened, in fact, 3 years ago. I will come to that in the course of the lecture. So The summary is here. First I will emphasize the very special character of nuclear weapons that makes them very different from conventional weapons. And then I will discuss the desirability and feasibility of a nuclear weapon-free world. Some past activities promoting nuclear disarmament and the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world will be reviewed. I'll discuss the significant developments initiated in January 2007 with the op-ed on the Wall Street Journal, co-authored by Schultz, Perry, Kissinger, and Nunn, and then the speech by President Obama in April 2009. And also, I'll talk about also another speech 3 years later in South Korea. And finally, I will outline recent developments and future steps towards a nuclear weapon-free world. So, the special character of nuclear weaponry, I just give 3 indications to emphasize the qualitative difference. So the first is the yield of nuclear A-bombs, and especially thermonuclear, so-called H-bombs explosion, is many orders of magnitudes larger than that of conventional explosions. I give an example. For instance, the larger thermonuclear test explosion, which was October 30, 1961 in the high atmosphere, performed by the Soviet Union, released in a fraction of a second an energy well over 50 megatons. And 50 megatons is more than the energy released by the explosion of 50 million tons, so 50 billion kilograms of conventional explosives, such as TNT. And what is perhaps more significant, because when one gives such large numbers, one may lose the significance, their significance is that this is more than 10 times larger than the estimated total of all previous explosions in war throughout history, including the 2 world wars with all their campered bombs, London, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in a fraction of a second, energy was liberated, which was maybe 5 times more than the whole energy liberated throughout the history of humankind until that time. That's one indication, I think rather striking. The second one is that nuclear weapons have never been used in war after they used to obliterate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was 6 and 9 August 1945. Not even when nuclear weapon countries were defeated by a non-nuclear weapon opponent, as the USA in Vietnam and Russia in Afghanistan. And third, all countries of the world except a few, United States, United Kingdom, Russia, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, have voluntarily renounced the acquisition of nuclear weaponry by becoming non-nuclear weapon parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and many of them, enough to cover more than half of the Earth, including the entire Southern Hemisphere, becoming party to a nuclear weapon-free zone, including many countries having the technological capability to manufacture nuclear weapons. So these are these 3 indications of the special character of nuclear weapons. Then I go to the desirability and feasibility of the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world. The desirability is far from obvious. In a world of nation states in which only very few of them possess nuclear weapons, it seems clear that it is preferable for them to keep these capabilities. In a world in which some states have a pariah connotation, possibly for very good reason, for instance because of a dismal human rights record, their rulers might feel that the possession of a nuclear weapon capability provides an essential insurance against external interventions. A country that faces an enemy having superior conventional forces may feel that the possession of a nuclear capability is an equalizer. A country encircled by several hostile neighbors that challenge its very right to existence may feel that the possession of a nuclear weapon capability is the ultimate guarantor of survival. And some thinkers argue that the existence of nuclear weapons, by making war exceedingly destructive, provides an indispensable ingredient to avoid major wars, hence it is a guarantor of peace. On the other hand, it is obvious that the spread of nuclear weaponry to many countries, and possibly even to subnational terrorist groups, entails sooner or later their actual use, with devastating consequences for our civilization, possibly even the disappearance of Homo sapiens. And it is indeed well known from worldwide opinion polls, to the extent these tests are reliable, that a significant majority of the inhabitants of this planet favor the total elimination of nuclear weaponry, including significant majority in most, perhaps all, the countries now possessing nuclear weapons. It is also remarkable that so many states have so far voluntarily renounced the acquisition of nuclear weapons, including quite a few states having the technical capability to manufacture nuclear weapons. But this regime of nuclear weapon non-proliferation cannot last indefinitely. It is now in danger of crumbling. The feasibility, instead, is, in my opinion, rather clear. The feasibility of the elimination, the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, I repeat, in some cases I repeat things. I think repetita juvent in teaching. Nuclear weapons have not been used in war. Wow, I think maybe I should keep this like this. Have not been used in war after August 9, 1945. There probably is no person in this room who was an adult at that time. I myself was 10. The total elimination of chemical weaponry as a usable military instrument has now been essentially achieved. Note that these weapons, chemical weapons, were used much more often in war than nuclear weapons, and that the verification of the universal respect of their abolition is much more cumbersome than it shall be for nuclear weapons, due to the much more extended and pervasive character of chemical rather than nuclear peaceful activities. Moreover, all countries of the world, except 8, have already voluntarily renounced nuclear weapons by having become full parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in addition, many of them having become full parties to nuclear weapon-free zone. And these treaties have efficient verification regimes. So I now go to discuss some past activities promoting nuclear disarmament and the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world, and this is a somewhat parochial selection of very few examples. I give two examples of two books. One is a book, I brought the cover of this book here. This is the English version of this book, which was published in the United States in 1990, and in parallel, a version in Russian was published in Moscow in 1991. And the title is Verification, Monitoring, Disarmament, and this was the first book on a very sensitive, yes, okay. But then I take that one away from you. Yes. It was, yes, it was the first book on a strategically very sensitive topic, which had all chapters co-signed by authors on the two sides of the Iron Curtain, which still existed. It was, of course, towards the end of the Cold War. And the second book, A Nuclear Weapon-Free World, Desirable, Feasible, so the same title as this talk, which was a Pugwash monograph. And I have here again, this is the cover of this book. In 1963, I think, 93, when still this objective looked more utopian than practical politics, I might say. But it was the beginning of a path in that direction. Then there was the Nobel Committee in 1995 decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize in 2 equal parts to Joseph Rotblat and to the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs for their efforts to diminish the part played by nuclear arms in international politics and in the long run to eliminate such arms. This is the official statement of the Nobel Committee. And this is Joseph Rotblat and myself at the time I was Secretary General, as it was said, and accepted this paraphernalia of the prize. Maybe they should add that this was the first time that the Nobel Prize was assigned to a person and to an organization. The rules of the Nobel Peace Prize is that it can be given at most to 3 persons or 3 entities, but for the first time it was split between one person, Joseph Rotblat. Maybe I will talk a little bit about him more tomorrow, and Pugwash. And in Pugwash, since it was given to an organization, we tried to divide the responsibilities of the various things to do in the ceremonies. And actually, there was one speech given by Rotblat on his own behalf, and there was a speech given on behalf of Pugwash, and it was given by the individual who at that time was the chair of the Pugwash Executive Committee and who is now the Special Assistant to President Obama for Science and Technology, John Holdren. So now, the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world, I say from desirable utopia to political reality, and I put, in some sense, a date to this transition, and this date is January 4, 2007, when the Wall Street Journal, that, as you probably know, is not a very leftist or pacifist journal, it tends to be rather on the conservative side, published an op-ed entitled A World Without Nuclear Weapons, and this was, I say, the coming out in favor of the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world by a bipartisan quartet of very eminent American statesmen, George Shultz, Bob Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn. And I quote the final sentence: "We endorse setting the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons and working energetically on the actions required to achieve that goal, beginning with the measures outlined above." And as you know, Mr. Shultz was Secretary of State from 82 to 89 with President Reagan. Mr. Perry was Secretary of Defense from 94 to 97 with President Clinton. Mr. Kissinger was Secretary of State from 73 to 77 with President Nixon, and Mr. Nunn is the former chairman for many, many years of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee. This bipartisan op-ed is very significant because of its authors, but even more so because of the avalanche of subsequent endorsements. For instance, in the United States, in this country, by the majority of the living Americans having served as Secretaries of State, Secretaries of Defense, and Special Assistant Special Assistants for International Security to the President. And in the rest of the world, by an impressive array of eminent personalities, too many to be reported, which very often took sort of the same format of a quartet of eminent individual politicians with maybe 2 from the left and 2 from the right writing an article or making a pronouncement. Again, I'm a little parochial, I will quote from Italy. This was, in a sense, the second one. The first was in Great Britain, the second was in Italy, but then there were many others in many parts, including a very important one in Germany. And so this is in Italy. Il Corriere della Sera is the main Italian newspaper. This was in July 2008, and the title is for a world without nuclear weapons. This is the article in Italian. And I translated the last sentence. It says, the diffusion of a new way of thinking, of a new shared wisdom is a fundamental step in this direction, to which also Italy must contribute. This direction is the elimination of nuclear weapons. It is necessary that on these themes, fundamental for the very survival of humankind, in spite of legitimate, indeed necessary political contrapositions, a superior common interest be recognized. And before showing you who the authors are, I should tell you that in Italy it's not traditional at all for politicians of very different affiliations to make statements together. There is not such an habit. In this case, there were, again, 4 top politicians: Massimo D'Alema, former Prime Minister and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, center-left; Gianfranco Fini, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and former Chairman of Parliament, in fact, Chairman of Parliament at the time of this statement, which was center-right; Giorgio Lamalfa, former Minister of European Affairs and previously Minister of the Budget; and Arturo Parisi, former Minister of Defense, center-left. So 2 at the time, center-right and center-left, and then myself in some sense as a representative of civil society. As I said, there were many analogous pronouncements all over the world in many other countries. And then we come to the perhaps most important, not perhaps, certainly most important pronouncement, which was by, I should also say that also in Russia there were such coming out by prominent individuals. The most important one was, of course, the Prague speech by President Obama, which was 5 April 2009. I will not read all of this, but just the final statement of that speech. And so he said, so today I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Applause. I am not naive. This goal will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. It will take patience and persistence. But now we, too, must ignore the voices who tell us that the world cannot change. We have to insist, yes, we can. And of course, you know better than me that yes, we can was the slogan under which Obama won this first election to president. And I don't think that he uses this slogan very often. So it's an indication of the commitment to this particular theme and this particular cause. So let me say that this advocacy of the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world, of the total elimination of nuclear weapons, is mainly based on 4 arguments. One is the end of the Cold War. The second is the intrinsic risk of the existence of nuclear weapons, the actual use of which has been avoided so far due to responsible caution, but also thanks to good luck. And I suggest I make propaganda for a book. See in this respect the very recent book by Erich Schlösser, Command and Control, which came out just a month ago in this country. He's an American journalist who has written this book, which is extremely impressive. I have here the cover of this book. It's a big book, 600 pages with 60 pages of notes, and it's a book about the nuclear accidents, mostly in this country. The nuclear in the sense of nuclear weapons, not nuclear energy-producing installations. Both nuclear accidents, of which there have been several, and also cases in which the world went very, very close to a global nuclear war. It's a very impressive book, very, very well researched, and I hope it will become a bestseller in the United States, and it will help will have a significant impact on public opinion. Third of these main arguments is the risk of a breakdown of the worldwide nuclear weapon non-proliferation regime, leading to the actual use of nuclear weapons with horrendous consequences. And fourth, the need of a common approach to fight, which means to prevent terrorism, including, I would like to emphasize, nuclear terrorism. And I think I want to say just a few words about nuclear terrorism. The risk of nuclear terrorism, the possibility that the sub-state group acquire the capability to engineer a nuclear explosion. So the explosion of a primitive Hiroshima-type nuclear device in a major city would be a sudden catastrophe comparable, perhaps worse, than any tragic event in human history. There exist terroristic groups who would cause such a disaster if they could. A primitive nuclear explosive device could be easily manufactured clandestinely in a target city by a small terrorist commando if they could get hold of a sufficient quantity of weapon-grade highly enriched uranium, and possibly also with weapon-grade plutonium, although this task is less easy. And I give you an idea of the parameters. 100 kilograms of weapon-grade highly enriched uranium would be more than enough. On the other hand, as a consequence of the enormous accumulation of weapon-grade highly enriched uranium during the Cold War, and in spite of a significant elimination of this material during the last two decades, by downblending it to low-enriched uranium, then used in nuclear reactors to produce electrical energy, there still are approximately 1 million kilograms of highly enriched uranium around. Most of it in Russia, enormous quantities also in the United States, and smaller quantities, but significantly larger than 100 kilograms in several other countries. This material, of course, is not available for sale and is in principle well protected, but not necessarily all of it in real practice. Although the situation has improved over the last years, especially in Russia, both due to the improvement of the economic situation there and thanks to outside collaborative interventions, mainly by the United States, under the so-called non-Lugar legislation. I consider still quite imminent the risk that a city be destroyed by a nuclear explosion engineered by a terroristic commando. Hence, I believe that more effort should be made to protect all the existing highly enriched uranium, to terminate all its civilian employments by converting all research and naval reactors still employing highly enriched uranium to using instead the compact low-enriched uranium now available as a viable alternative, and especially to eliminate by downblending as much highly enriched uranium as possible, as quickly as possible. The most important step in this direction would have been an extension, hopefully envisaging a faster pace, of the highly enriched uranium deal among the United States and Russia, whose implementation has just been completed after having eliminated 500 tons, so 500,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium over 20 years. This has been a very great achievement, this cooperative program, which, by the way, was done without any, as it was said, without any cost to the taxpayer, because it was a commercial agreement in which the utilities in the United States paid for this low-enriched uranium, which is the fuel of the energy-producing reactors in the United States, which was obtained by downblending the highly enriched uranium. I think something like 1/3 of the nuclear energy produced in the United States comes from this fuel, which comes from the downblending of the Russian highly enriched uranium, which was produced during the Cold War for weapons. Unfortunately, the hope of an extension of this agreement I don't think it is likely, mainly because of another view about nuclear weapons in Russia and the need of maintaining supply of highly enriched uranium. Positive developments on the worldwide protection of nuclear materials are now an accepted priority of the international community, as for instance shown by the recent meeting convened at the highest level in Washington in April 2010 and its follow-up in Seoul in March 2012. The Obama administration has taken this task much more seriously than it was previously done. I still believe that more could and should be done, and let me emphasize that the complete elimination of highly enriched uranium is quite compatible with the continuation of the utilization of nuclear energy. It is a different thing, the issue of whether or not to maintain nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, production of energy, of electricity by nuclear energy, because that can be separated from the issue of having highly enriched uranium. You don't need highly enriched uranium to produce energy, you need low enriched uranium. Now I go to some positive developments in the progress towards a nuclear weapon-free world, and this is an indication of some developments. One, of course, is the New START agreement among the United States and Russia, which meant the resumption of verified nuclear arms control sanctioned by treaties, and it has envisaged some reduction of the arsenal of the two nuclear powers. It was signed in April 2010 and entered into force in February 2011. In April 12, what happens here? Yeah, 12/13, 2010, there was this nuclear security summit, which I mentioned, focused on improving the security of nuclear materials, in particular highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And it was a very big affair. It was attended by 47 states, 30 of them represented by their heads of state or heads of government. So a commitment was signed to strengthen the global nuclear security regime, and the goal set by President Obama, who actually convened this meeting and mentioned it in this Prague speech, was to secure all vulnerable nuclear material within 4 years. As I said, another such meeting, the third one, will be held in next year, in 2014. This goal has not yet been realized, but progress has certainly been made in this direction. Well, yeah, as I say, this is again on this topic of securing the materials that might be used by terrorists. There was a follow-up meeting in Seoul and in 2012, and this is the communique. I will not read it, all of it. Just the end is we reaffirm our shared goals of nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. In May 2010, significant progress in transparency by the United States was achieved with the complete disclosure of the United States nuclear arsenal. Officially, of course, it was already, this information was already very well known, the United States being a transparent country in this respect, but nevertheless, it was the first time that it was officially, the data was given, and more importantly, of the new nuclear posture review. The nuclear posture review is the document that states the purpose of nuclear weapons and how they should be used. It had been previously classified, and it was made public by the Obama administration in 2010, and it did restrict the circumstances of possible employment of nuclear weapons. And the statement, the key statement was that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack performed with nuclear weapons. The stronger statement would have been to say that the sole role of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack performed with nuclear weapons, and it did not go so far. But it is rather close to that, and you understand that once the doctrine is that the sole role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear weapons, in a sense, logically, the consequence is that you have to go to a nuclear weapon-free world, because the only role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear weapons. Until now, it is not so. I mean, even in the United States, there is this notion that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is that. In the past, of course, the role of nuclear weapons was much broader. It was, for instance, perceived as preventing a conventional attack by the Soviet Union in Europe, because the notion then was that the West, so to say, was that the Soviet Union was much stronger in conventional forces, especially in Europe, and therefore the nuclear weapons was needed to deter a conventional attack. Now, to some extent, the situation has been reversed. Now it's the Soviet Union that feels that she is inferior in conventional forces, also due to the enlargement of NATO, and therefore they tend to rely more on nuclear weapons. Okay. Then, in May 2010, there was the quinquennial NPT review conference. The Non-Proliferation Treaty envisages every 5 years a review conference of the status of the non-proliferation regime in the world. And the, the previous one in May 2005 had ended in disarray, I think largely because of the rather arrogant attitude of the Bush administration, while in 2010 it ended with a unanimous agreement. Well, this was still what I call the arrogant attitude. While the non-nuclear weapon states were severely urged not to proliferate, no progress in nuclear disarmament by the nuclear weapon states was envisaged. In 2010, there was an effort to have a more balanced approach, and in particular, some commitments were taken. You must understand that there is a certain amount of dynamics among the countries that have renounced nuclear weapons and the countries that have nuclear weapons inside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so the 5 recognized nuclear weapon countries, because the Non-Proliferation Treaty was a commitment in which the non-nuclear weapon countries renounced nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapon countries took a commitment eventually to go to a nuclear weapon-free world. Not at a fixed time, but to work in that direction, and so there is pressure by the other countries to say, well, you should make more and more progress. Some commitments were taken in the 2010 review conference, which unfortunately have not been implemented. I just mentioned 2 important ones. One was to convene a conference on the Middle East aimed at working towards the creation of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, not only nuclear, chemical, and biological, with a commitment to have an initial meeting to discuss this topic in last year, in December of 2012, and that did not come to pass because of the opposition of Israel and the United States supporting Israel. It's still an open problem. And the other commitment to some extent was that the United States would ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which forbids nuclear tests, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was actually signed by President Clinton as the first country in the world to sign it, but then it was not ratified by the Senate, and it is unlikely that it will be ratified because I think it has become a kind of an internal policy problem in this country. There is not a sufficient majority to ratify a treaty. As you know, it needs 67 members of the Senate, and there is no such majority to make this step. But this, of course, means that a certain unhappiness is brewing among the non-nuclear weapon countries. Well, this I quote another. There have been, in fact, more than one additional Wall Street Journal op-eds by the quartet, and this is some significance. As I said, also many other such pronouncements around the world. I quote here again, among many others, there was a common, an article co-signed by Margaret Albright, which was the US Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001, and Igor Ivanov, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, so the counterpart from 1998 to 2004, entitled Moving Ahead in Reducing Nuclear Arms, with several suggestions of steps to do. So there have been many such moves, and I indicate some recent hopeful developments, which may indicate my wishful thinking. One is, of course, the improvement of the relations among Russia and the United States, which is key to this problematic, including the prospect of a joint development of anti-ballistic missile capabilities, and perhaps just now a joint management of the crisis in Syria connected with the use of chemical weapons. This issue is quite open. The postponement by the new conservative liberal UK government of the decision to develop a new generation of Triton submarines, the British nuclear weapon carriers, they have come to the end of their life, and Great Britain has to decide what to do. I mean, and it's a much debated issue in Great Britain. It is conceivable that they might decide to give up altogether nuclear weapons, although I don't think it's very probable, but it is a possibility. Perhaps a new resolve by China in its own interest to push North Korea to abandon their nuclear weapon program, leading to a nuclear weapon-free Korean peninsula and the formal end of the Korean conflict. Again, this issue is quite open, and the emergence of a NATO attitude more open to collaborating with Russia and sharing the United States' tendency to restrict the role of nuclear weaponry and to pursue the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world, with some non-negative responsive signals by Russia. But again, significant progress not yet achieved, and in Europe, the East European countries are more reluctant to proceed in that direction because they feel still antagonism, or at least they are still very much afraid of Russia, also for that long historical reason, Poland and Russia and such things. The creation of a European leadership network of multilateral nuclear disarmament, for multilateral nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, it's called ELN, mainly composed of eminent personalities, top politicians, former highest-ranking military commanders. The convener is Lord Desmond Brown, former UK Minister of Defence, and this European Leadership Network is committed towards a nuclear weapon-free world. And I give here the reference on the web for this thing. Future steps towards a nuclear weapon-free world, further progress in the reset of relationship among the United States and Russia, from conflict to partnership. There was this slogan which was created by Olof Palme a long time ago, which was common security, with the involvement of China. I would submit to you that with the end of the Cold War and with the great changes in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, now the United States and Russia are no more ideologically opposed. Both are societies based on capitalism, you may say. And moreover, they in fact have a common enemy, which is terrorism and the destabilization of the world. So in a sense, it should be natural that they should proceed more and more in unison in the name of common security. And to some extent, this is also true for China. So this is, in my opinion, the most optimistic vision that is justified to have. Then future steps, it's further progress in nuclear disarmament, bilateral United States, Russia, and here there are many possible topics: strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, warheads behind delivery vehicles, space, conventional weapons. Involvement of all nuclear weapon countries, a universal convention with adequate verification, perhaps on the model of the Chemical Weapon Convention, perhaps backed by additional nuclear weapon-free zones, for instance, in the extended Middle East. And I also want to mention that the very notion of a nuclear weapon-free world, what does it mean? One notion is what sometimes is called global zero, so no nuclear weapons in any country. But another notion, which I have called asymptotic in the sense of mathematics, which means that a world in which a very long delay, asymptotically in infinite time, is technologically required for any reconstitution of nuclear arsenals. Because, of course, you cannot eliminate the notion of the possibility of construct nuclear weapons, but you can envisage a world where the reconstitution of nuclear weapons will take a very long time, and therefore there could be measures to prevent it. The possible early unilateral or reciprocal steps, one is, of course, ratification by the United States Senate of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and hopefully subsequent entry into force of this treaty. This is not an easy achievement because it requires ratification by several other key countries, including India and Pakistan, for instance. A change of the nuclear posture with the notion that the sole role of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack with nuclear weapons. Then the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world, in a sense, becomes a logical consequence, which of course doesn't mean that it would happen because logic doesn't rule in the world. But still, it's a very important eventual step because the nuclear posture review, in fact, do affect policy to a very large extent. And another very important development, which is hopeful, is the termination of the quick alert status of nuclear missiles, which now still envisage their launch within minutes, a very dangerous posture still adopted by the United States and Russia. And I quote here Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense of the United States from 94 to 97. He wrote, "I believe that we avoided nuclear catastrophe as much by good luck as by good management." And again, read the book this book, Command and Control, by Erich Schlösser, to see how true this was. Well, here I have, I'm near the end, again, a more recent remarks by President Obama in March 26 of last year. This was a speech in South Korea, at the university in South Korea, and I just took some sentences. 3 years ago, I traveled to Prague and I declared America's commitment to stopping the spread of nuclear weapons and to seeking a world without them. I said I knew that this goal would not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime, but I knew we had to begin with concrete steps. And in your generation, I see the spirit we need in this endeavor, an optimism that beats in the hearts of so many young people around the world. It's that refusal to accept the world as it is, the imagination to see the world as it ought to be, and the courage to turn that vision into reality. So today with you, I want to take stock of our journey and chart our next steps. And then I'll read again another piece of this, the final part of this speech, which to me seems to indicate a really strong personal commitment. He says, now American leadership has been essential to progress in a second area, because he had talked about other things, taking concrete steps towards a world without nuclear weapons. As a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, this is our obligation, and it's one that I take very seriously. But I believe the United States has a unique responsibility to act. Indeed, we have a moral obligation. I say this as president of the only nation ever to use nuclear weapons. I say it as a commander-in-chief who knows that our nuclear codes are never far from my side. Most of all, I say it as a father who wants my two young daughters to grow up in a world where everything they know and love can't be instantly wiped out. This is the rest of the speech, which I will not go through. And finally, a final personal note by myself, not by President Obama. It is known that public opinions worldwide, I repeat something I already said, favor by significant majorities the transitions to a nuclear weapon-free world. But there are some skeptics, especially among the so-called nuclear weapon experts, especially among those with a civilian background who make a living by pontificating on these matters. From these quarters, it is often stated that it is impossible to disinvent nuclear weapons. But many social institutions have been disinvented over time. And I give some examples. The anthropophagy of enemy prisoners, which was a habit that existed. Slavery. In democratic countries, restrictions by social status, land property, by gender, by race, to the universal right to vote. Chemical weaponry, after these weapons had been repeatedly used during the last century, entailing verification of the world chemical industry, a more daunting task than verifying peaceful nuclear activities in a nuclear weapon-free world. And I would say that even war itself has now become unthinkable in certain contexts, such as Western Europe, where the two world wars took place during the last century. So this is a major development, and I think it is really unthinkable that nowadays France and England or Germany, Italy will go to war. There are disagreements, but it's inconceivable to solve them by war. And this is the part of the world where the last World War emerged and therefore. As previously emphasized, nuclear weapons have been employed in war only twice, 6 and 9 August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They have never been used afterwards, and I repeat, even when states possessing enormous nuclear arsenals were defeated in war by states without nuclear weapons, for instance, the United States in Vietnam and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. This is the first time in human history that something of the kind happens. It is an indication that in some quite significant sense, we already live in a nuclear weapon-free world, a world where nuclear weapons are de facto, if not yet de jure, unusable. Were it not so, how to explain the fact that by becoming parties to the non-proliferation, I lost myself. Yes. How to explain the fact that by becoming parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and possibly in addition to a nuclear weapon-free world, almost all world states have voluntarily given up the option to acquire a nuclear weapons arsenal, including, again I repeat, several states for whom acquiring such a capability would be technologically quite easy. But I emphasize that this consensus is now at risk unless the nuclear weapon countries and, in the first place, the United States and Russia make progress towards a nuclear weapon-free world. This also shows that a political strategic development considered unfeasible can indeed happen. After the Cuban nuclear missile crisis that brought the world close to a nuclear catastrophe in autumn 1962, President Kennedy and other world leaders pushed strongly for the establishment of a worldwide nuclear weapon non-proliferation regime. The Non-Proliferation Treaty entered into force in 1970, but as emphasized by those who opposed the NPT, and also in Italy, I was involved in this debate, not opposing it but supporting it, its success at that time was quite doubtful. Many nuclear weapon pundits predicted that within 1-2 decades, 20-30 states would have acquired nuclear weapons. Indeed, in the 1960s, many states had initiated programs aimed at developing nuclear weapons, and several of them were quite opposed to the NPT. And in addition, 2 of the 5 nuclear weapon states, as defined by the NPT, were strongly opposed to the NPT, the France of de Gaulle and the China of Mao. Yet, the NPT turned out to be a great success. More than 4 decades later, all countries of the world are full parties, except for only 3 or 4, which are India, Pakistan, Israel, and perhaps North Korea, which was a party, then it went out, and so it's a complicated case. But again, I emphasize that this large consensus is now at risk. And I think this is my last transparency. The recent significant surge of pronouncements by political leaders worldwide in favor of a transition to a nuclear weapon-free world brings to mind the famous dictum attributed to Victor Hugo: "Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come." This is why I'm confident that such a transition is in theory. It's proceeding. Obama said in Prague and again in South Korea that this goal perhaps will not be reached in his lifetime. I'm much older than he is, yet I entertain the hope, based on the evidence outlined above, that it might perhaps be achieved in my lifetime, but perhaps after some catastrophic nuclear explosion. And finally, I end with the question, might a major step towards the achievement of a nuclear weapon-free world be made during the second Obama term? And I'll stop here.
We would like to take your questions now. There is a microphone.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Can you guys hear? One of the biggest proponents of a nuclear Iran is a political scientist, Kenneth Waltz. And he says a nuclear Iran is maybe most stabilizing in the Middle East because the Middle East is the only region that only has a sole nuclear power, Israel. So I was wondering if you could care to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I know the point of view of Professor Waltz, and I'm not a political scientist, and I think it's total nonsense. I mean, this is this idea that nuclear weapons have a stabilizing influence, which in some circumstances may have been true throughout the Cold War. Maybe the presence of nuclear weapons has been a stabilizing influence. But on the other hand, the risks associated with the presence of nuclear weapons are very serious. You should listen to Secretary of Defense Perry more than to Professor Waltz, and because I think he's more knowledgeable, and you should read Command and Control. And the idea that nuclear weapons may stabilize is really a very myopic view, because eventually, unless progress is made towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, they will inevitably spread. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, it will be the beginning of a spread of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia will acquire nuclear weapons. Egypt will go for nuclear weapons, and it will be the beginning of the collapse of the non-proliferation regime. You will see then Brazil going for nuclear weapons, Argentina will go for nuclear weapons, and so more and more. Japan eventually will go in that direction, and this will mean that nuclear weapons eventually will be used, because until now the non-use has been a miracle, and it will be a total disaster.
I got a question about a specific nuclear weapons country. In the case of Israel, it's kind of a unique situation because they develop nuclear weapons not to deter another nuclear weapons state, but more so because they're surrounded by 1 billion people who one of the few things that they can agree on is that Israel shouldn't exist. So I'm wondering, if the miracle were to happen that Israel were to give up its nuclear weapons, would you support something in exchange for that to help protect them or to satisfy their security concerns, such as giving them membership into NATO?
Well, I think giving membership in NATO is, in a sense, is a minor form of support. I think that much more should happen. In other words, and I think that Israel will not give up its nuclear weapons until this much more occurs. And the much more is the acceptance of Israel by all the surrounding states, and the fact that it is accepted. Israel, it has been a trauma perhaps that the Zionists came there, that established themselves, but by now it is not at all inconceivable that the other states will accept the existence of Israel, that there will be peace among Israel and all the surrounding states. This is the prospect in which it will be possible to achieve the renunciation by Israel to nuclear weapons, chemical weapons also. They haven't ratified the Chemical Weapon Convention, and the establishment eventually of a nuclear weapon free, of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, which was one of the requests, in fact, by Israel, that they should cover all the weapons of mass destruction, and which would be verified largely by the zone, so by the Israelis themselves. So it is clear that the prospect should be of an end of the conflict, and in that context, of course, that there will have to be also an end of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So perhaps the establishment of two states. This is the prospect in which one may hope so. It is not pie in the sky, it is difficult, but that is the prospect, and in that prospect then one may expect the total elimination of nuclear weapons in that region.
Dr. Francesco, thank you for your talk. As a part of my interest in the Middle East, in bringing peace to the Middle East, or making research about it, I've read about Saudi Arabia's not denying its capabilities of acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, at that point, I was asked, how would you urge Saudi Arabia not to make such a big mistake of acquiring such? What would your response be to that? How would you urge Saudi Arabian monarchies not to actually think of it or not to proceed with such an idea?
Well, in a sense, the answer is the same as I gave before. So the only prospect is that eventually there be overcoming the conflicts in the whole area in the Middle East, and acceptance by all states of a relationship of common recognition and survival, that every state will have its own internal development without being forced by other states to change regime and have their own development. It's a complicated region, and I'm not an expert in particular. There is this controversy about two branches of the Islamic religion, Shiites and Sunnis, which is important. So these are difficult problems, but can hopefully be solved by politics. after all, I would say they are less serious than it was the great divide between the Western world and the Soviet Union, and which has been solved in a way, very, very quickly, and without any bloodshed. Thanks to, I think, if I should name a name, I would say Gorbachev. But of course, it was not only him; it was the society, his environment, and so on. But it has happened, and it was, in a way, a miracle. And one can hope for an analogous miracle involving the enlarged Middle East. And the other region where also one needs, and it's conceivable, an analogous miracle is in the relationship between India, Pakistan, and resolving the conflict about Kashmir.
Thank you.
In the video introduction to your presentation, it was mentioned that perhaps now more than ever is the risk of a nuclear catastrophe, be it purposeful or accidental, is greater than ever. And you didn't comment specifically on that in your presentation. I was just wondering exactly what was your opinion on that? Like, are we more at risk now than we have been in the past? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think it's for me it's hard to say. I mean, whether it's really larger. For instance, if you think of the relationship between India and Pakistan, this relationship involve more of a danger of an eventual nuclear conflict, I think, because the situation is more unstable. The countries are very close to each other. There have been war episodes among the two countries. So in that context, I would say there is more of a danger. The other aspects, I think that the danger of a nuclear war between the United States and Russia has certainly decreased over time. But still, and I must say it seems absurd to me that still nuclear weapons are kept on quick alert with the possibility of using them within minutes, which is to me a great element of danger. So it's very hard to assess whether this danger is greater than it was in the past. In the past, there have been many episodes in which it was very, very close to even just by mistakes. There would be a total catastrophe. I mean, just to mention one, to give you an idea, at one time, by mistake, a tape was put into the system in the United States, which was the tape of an exercise of what would happen in the case of an attack by the Soviet Union. And so this tape went to all the receiving stations, showing missiles arriving, showing an actual attack by the Soviet Union, which was an exercise, but by mistake it was put in not as an exercise. And it was a very close call that there was not a response, because it really looked like a nuclear attack coming out of the blue. So these possibilities exist as long as nuclear weapons exist. They exist much more when nuclear weapons are kept on high alert, as they still are. And so it's hard to give an assessment. And I think the danger of a terroristic use has very much increased with respect to the past. But I wouldn't be able to give an exact measurement of whether. On the other hand, if you have some possibility that the catastrophe happens, the more time goes by, the more is probable that eventually it will happen, because it's just in the passing of time, and unless you eliminate the causes, eventually bad events will happen.
Maybe I'm oversimplifying the facts, but looks like...
But you are a mathematician, so...
but looks like the process towards a chemical weapon-free world has been more successful for the nuclear weapons. If this is true, what issues made that possible? What is the main difference? What has been the difference historically, or maybe from a physical point of view, between chemical and nuclear weapons?
Well, I think it's complicated to reply. I mean, one component of this is the fact that chemical weapons have been used, and have been used extensively, not only in the First World War in Europe, but they've been used in the Iran-Iraq war by Iraq, and against also the citizens of Iraq, the Kurds. So with thousands and thousands of casualties. So that has been, I think, a strong push towards the elimination of chemical weaponry. The other reason that people might say is that because there is this other level of weapons which are much more powerful in a way, nuclear weapons, it was possible to achieve the elimination. This is what the people who think that nuclear weapons are very important and should be retained as a stability element, they will say, you see, it was the existence of nuclear weapons that allowed reaching an agreement to eliminate chemical weapons. Then, you know, historically, how this came about, it's a complicated. It was a long negotiation. In fact, one in which Pugwash played an important role, I think. One of the achievements of Pugwash is to involve in the negotiation from this country, from the United States, the leadership of the something that I don't know the exact name, but it's the American Association of Chemical Manufacturers. There is such an association, which is the association of all the chemical industries. And the chemical industries, the natural reaction to the prospect of having a chemical weapon convention was skeptical and negative, because it involved for them, not because they wanted to make money out of building chemical weapons, but because they envisaged the nuisance and the expense for them of having this supervision and having to make reports about all the elements that could be the precursors of nuclear weapons. So it was a burden on the chemical industry, and it was convincing these people was very important, and in fact the leadership became a strong supporter of the Chemical Weapon Convention, and this was a very important element to bring it about, because of course the chemical industry of the United States is the most important in the world. So it's a very complicated question that you have asked me, and maybe one should really ask professional historians to study this problem of how the Chemical Weapon Convention eventually was achieved.
There. Hello? Okay, cool. I was just wondering if you maybe had some input on the consensus of that nuclear free world treaty that you were talking about, and maybe what the consensus has as a significance to the countries that aren't in it that you named. And I'm wondering if you think maybe why they should care, because I've just kind of assumed that they don't, because if they really did, they would have just been a part of the treaty by now.
I'm afraid that, you know, I'm a bit deaf.
Okay. I'll repeat it. Don't worry about it.
I didn't catch your question.
Like, can you maybe speak on behalf of the consensus of the treaty that you were talking of that 4 countries aren't a part of? And if you think their consensus should be significant to the 4 countries that aren't in it? And I'm only asking that because I'm kind of assuming that they don't really care because they haven't really joined the treaty.
You are thinking about India, Pakistan, and in Israel.
Yeah.
And well, you know, the motivation why these countries acquire nuclear weapons is complicated. I mean, India is a very large country, is the largest democracy, and it has a very strong pride And so India for a long time was a strong pusher for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And when this process did not proceed, at some point switched over and decided, well, why should we not develop nuclear weapons? And so this kind of, you might say, patriotic, nationalistic sentiment was very important. Another one was, of course, the relationship with China. There were some skirmishes, in fact. So then, because India acquired nuclear weapons, Pakistan felt the need to acquire nuclear weapons, and so this was the development of that particular situation. Israel is a different story. It was already mentioned. Israel feels that it exists as a very small country in the middle of other states, some of which have not accepted its very existence, and therefore feels threatened, and because of that it developed a great military strength in conventional forces and also in non-conventional forces like nuclear weapons. In addition, as of course you know, Israel was born after the Holocaust, and so they have a very strong feeling of you may say, of fear, of annihilation based on what really happened. So and the example of North Korea is again a specific case connected with the specific regime that exists in that country. So each of these has to be looked in by itself, each of these conflicts and situation in the specific context. I don't think one can say something in general about these four countries.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there, but I guess I should ask, like, why should these four countries maybe be concerned by not being in the treaty?
Why say they should be concerned?
Yeah, like, is the rest of the world do they have some kind of view towards them that might put them in a negative light where they should maybe be concerned about not being in the treaty? Or, I don't know, maybe if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Why they should be concerned about not being in the treaty? Well, they simply never signed the treaty, and the official position of India is that they will be prepared to give up nuclear weapons once a nuclear weapon-free world is achieved, and that is their position. Then, in actual policy, when the first nuclear test was performed by India, there was great jubilation in the country, and because of this feeling of national identity and frustration with respect to the rest of the world.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you again for being here. I just have a question. I'm actually interested in what your opinion on nuclear energy and like the new advancements in nuclear energy, such as integral fast reactors and generation 4 reactors, as well as power processing technology, might have, or what is your opinion on the future of nuclear energy, essentially?
Well, first of all, let me say that I have always thought that Pugwash should stay away from the controversy about nuclear energy. I mean, it should focus on the issue of nuclear weapons, but the controversy about nuclear energy, Pugwash should stay away from it, and me too, stay away from it. For one reason also, I am not really an expert on nuclear energy. I know something because I'm a physicist.
Yeah, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to ask you. Yeah.
Not specifically. One thing I would say is that I understand that many people have a great doubt about whether it is at all wise to reprocess plutonium, and which is an element of danger with respect to proliferation, and it does not seem to be justified on economic grounds. So that I would say that perhaps plutonium should not be reprocessed. and the countries that have accumulated a lot of plutonium now have a problem with it, and also they have raised a suspicion that in some sense this has been accumulated also as an edge towards the possibility of building nuclear weapons. The classical example is Japan, that has, as you know, accumulated a lot of plutonium with the official justification that it was needed for future reactors. But maybe, not maybe, but certainly some people in Japan had also second thoughts in this respect. So it's a complicated issue. I mean, and the specific issue of nuclear energy vis-à-vis other forms of energy, I don't feel I'm competent enough on this issue to have an opinion. I don't really have an opinion that is worth taking seriously by this audience.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.